House of the Dragon's second season tells us right from the opening scene that it's going to be bigger than the first. It opens with a shot of a raven carrying its message all the way to the far north of Westeros for a fantastic reveal of Winterfell. It's not a huge surprise since we knew Rhaenyra sent her oldest son Lucerys to secure the support of House Stark at the end of last season, but I don't know, seeing their ancestral home that was the backdrop for so many memorable scenes from the original series still packed a punch for me. When she was sending him off, Rhaenyra told Jace that she expected he might hit it off with Cregan Stark since they were pretty close in age, and that appears to be the case in the short time we see them together. And one thing that jumps out here is not only does Jace take his responsibility seriously, but this also seems to be something he's good at, and his inexperience isn't an issue. Before we get to that, there's a bit of voiceover where Cregan does a refresher on the Norse history and how since the days of the first men they've stood as guardians against the cold and the dark. He talks about the Night's Watch and how his ancestor Torrhen Stark started the tradition of sending 1 of 10 men from each family to take the Black and fortify the Watch. Something that was embraced as an honor because the North must stand ready. After all, winter is coming. And when he says the thing, call me corny or whatever, but it really got me pumped up for this season. Oh, and seeing him walking around with the Stark's ancestral Valyrian steel blade ice on his back was cool too. Plus the wall. Turns out they're not at Winterfell. Cregan brought him there to give him a better idea of what he's dealing with as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. Jace knows the history and uses that to his advantage, pointing out that they're in the exact same place their ancestors treated during the conquest. He says Torrhen would have died before bending the knee if he didn't believe Aegon the Conqueror could bring unity to the Seven Kingdoms. That unity is now under threat, and the realm will be torn apart if men do not remember their oaths to King Viserys and his rightful heir. And well, first things first, the Starks do not forget oaths, full stop. But Cregan explains it's not that simple. He's got dual responsibilities, and with winter around the corner, his duty to the wall takes precedence. Jace tries to write this off as them guarding against the weather and some wildlings, but Lord Stark straightens him out. He tells him the story about how when King Jaehaerys and Queen Alicent came to see the wall, their dragons refused to cross it. It's not like his ancestors just had this crazy idea to build this giant wall to keep out the weather. So the threat is real and he needs the majority of his forces there, and he's not flexible on that. He does have 2,000 graybeards he can spare though, and when prompted promises they'll fight hard. Like Northerners. Then they get interrupted when one of his men brings him an urgent message from Dragonstone. I guess the raven we saw at the beginning was the first part of the relay because obviously Winterfell's pretty far from the wall. But from the look on his face, we can tell it's about Luke's death, and that brings an end to our trip up north for now. A couple of things to add here. It really was great to visit the North again, and I'm guessing because they kept it this brief, it means that Mushroom's version of the story didn't happen. If you're not familiar with the book Fire and Blood, there are multiple accounts of different things that happen in the Targaryens' history. It's put together by Archmaester Gildain, who uses writings from maesters, a septon, and the testimony of the court fool Mushroom. His versions tend to be the most salacious, and in his version of the trip to the north, Jace got enchanted by what he calls a wolf girl, and ended up marrying this bastard daughter of the late Lord Rickon Stark because he was so into her and wanted to get down. When Cregan found out and called them on it, Sarah Snow assured him that they'd gone out and gotten hitched in front of Winterfell's Godswood before she let him seal the deal. Mushroom also claims that Vermax left a clutch of dragon's eggs at Winterfell, which Gildain says is equally absurd. The made-up author of the fake history book says, whilst it is true that determining the sex of a living dragon is a nigh-on impossible task, no other source mentions Vermax producing so much as a single egg, so it must be assumed that he was male. There is the idea that dragons can change sex when they need to, but as far as the Archmaester's concerned, that's too ludicrous to consider. Next, we visit Dragonstone and see an exhausted Rhaenys arrive on her dragon Meleys. Before she can even get sorted, Daemon comes in and tells her they're going back out. She was out doing her part to help hold the blockade, and in that she's responsible for patrolling over 100 miles of open sea by herself, and that means her dragon needs to eat, so she's not up for it. Remember, thanks to Corlys, they control the narrow sea and the shipping lanes, and if they can keep up the blockade, they can cut King's Landing off. This isn't something that sways Daemon, and he tells her his plan to go to King's Landing to kill Vhagar, which is something he can't do by himself, so he tries to insist. Together they could kill the oldest, biggest, meanest dragon and her rider and make it a son for her son. They could probably pull that off. Season 1 established that Aemond is not the most experienced rider, especially compared to Daemon and Rhaenys. But it also established that Rhaenys isn't a loose cannon, so she's not interested unless it's a direct order from the queen. And when she puts it that way, Daemon says she's still absent. And in his words, that has him stuck there waging her war while he should be at Harrenhal bending knees. She suggests maybe what he really ought to be doing is just simply waiting for her to return. She thinks it's completely understandable that Rhaenyra is gone because she's grieving, and to him that's just another way of saying she's prioritizing her duties as a mother while shirking her duties as the queen. She talks about a raven bringing her news of the death of her daughter Laena, which was Daemon's previous wife, and how she was stuck in disbelief until she saw her mortal remains. The point being that Rhaenyra needs closure. She needs to recover Luke's body before she'll be able to move on. Apparently that's what she's out doing. We do see a cutscene of her later staring at Storm's End from across Shipbreaker's Bay. And Daemon thinks it was foolish for her to go alone, and it's interesting that he says that, because it's apparent that some of his pent-up frustration is related to him being worried about her. He questions what might happen if she encountered Aemon, and Rhaenys says that she would pity Aemon, which I guess you can understand what she's saying. Rhaenyra is fierce, and she lost her son, which is a whole other level, but he's not wrong either. If he can't take Vhagar with Caraxes, then based on everything we know, if that were to happen, then the war would be over. One-on-one, she wouldn't have a chance on Syrax. Rhaenys thinks it was smart to not act on the vengeful impulse that others might have, and he points out that if she had acted when she had the chance at the Dragon Pit, Aegon's line would have been extinguished and Luke would be alive. This might be technically true, and something that gets said in the heat of the moment, but also totally unfair and not helpful for the current situation. He tries to get her to go one last time, and even tries to command her, and she just brushes him off saying, "Would that you were the king." On Driftmark, Corlys talks to a new character named Alan Hall, who's played by Abubakar Salim, who featured in another show I used to cover, Raised by Wolves. However, it took a second to recognize him because in Hot D, his character looks a little bit more like a tank. You'll remember Corlys was gravely injured in the Stepstones after dipping out on Rhaenys for 6 years to do war stuff after their son Laenor died. Because no one was sure if he'd survive, there was a dispute over his succession, because he named Rhaenyra and Harlan's son Lucerys as his heir. Of course, the cover story was that he was Laenor's son, which is why Corlys named him, but no one really believed that. Still, it is treason to suggest Rhaenyra's children are bastards, so when Corlys' brother lost his bid to become the heir of Driftmark and called them that in front of King Viserys after he shocked everyone and shuffled his dying ass to the Iron Throne, Daemon split Vaemon Valerian's head into 2 pieces with Dark Sister. Corlys eventually recovered from his injuries and came around to supporting Rhaenyra and the Blacks because Rhaenys made a deal to betroth her daughter Laena's children, Baela and Rhaena, to Rhaenyra's sons Luke and Jace. His heir Lucerys also died while being eaten by Aemon Targaryen's dragon Vhagar in the finale, which is why it's kind of a gut punch when Alan hands him the dagger that he had commissioned for him. We also find out that Alan was the one who saved his life and pulled him out of the ocean after his accident. He says he was just doing his duty, but Corlys makes a point of saying he's in debt to him before Alan walks away to get back to his work. It's the kind of scene where it feels like some things are left unsaid, or it's an encounter that will take on a different meaning when we look back on it, after we learn more about these two and their relationship. Corlys also seems different here. I know I was just talking about his injury, but he still had the same presence after his recovery when he made his dramatic entrance to the painted table scene in the finale. From there, we go to King's Landing, where everyone's on high alert as Vhagar returns. King Aegon interrupts his sister wife, Helaena, who's working on some needlework, looking for their son, Jaehaerys. It's kind of funny that he has to check his daughter Jaehaera since they look so much alike. This appears to be Aegon trying to take a more active role in his heir's development because he wants to take him to the small council meeting. It's probably a reaction to his father Viserys never taking an interest in him, which I guess is a good thing, but he also reveals himself as not knowing much about his son in the process since he doesn't know where he spends his days. Speaking of not paying attention to your kids, before Aegon leaves, Helaena tells him she's afraid, and he tells her she has nothing to worry about with Vhagar guarding the city. She explains it's not the dragons she's afraid of, it's the rats. Given what happens at the end of the episode, this is further confirmation that she can see the future, which likely comes through the prophetic dreams that several Targaryens have had throughout their family's history. This is something Viserys was fascinated by, if not obsessed with. And I still think it's a great little story detail that he fathered a dreamer but never paid enough attention to her to find out about her gift. No one pays attention. Aegon essentially just rolls his eyes and says, "The queen is an enduring mystery, is she not, when she brings up the rats here?" Something that we saw a bunch of times in the first season. And you get the sense that she'll continue to drop prophecy and everyone will just continue to think she's weird and not pay attention due to her neurodivergent nature. So the main things that stand out in the scene are that Helaena is still one of the most interesting characters, and a real example of the show adding some depth to a very underdeveloped character from the books, and that Tom Glencarney is determined to make Aegon a fun character to watch and might even make you forget what an awful human being he is. Then in a completely unexpected transition, it cuts to Queen Alicent getting head from her sworn protector Criston Cole. I did write that sentence and I did say it out loud. And in typical Westerosi form, the show doesn't pull any punches as we see Sir Criston going for it. This is somewhat scandalous since Knights of the King's Guard aren't supposed to do that sort of thing, but it also makes sense because people like to have sex, and it's kind of silly to think they'd go their whole lives without it. I imagine people who dislike the Greens will see this as hypocrisy, and maybe it is. Alicent and Criston do try to lean into the perceived moral superiority they have over the Blacks. But if you look at it for what it is, Cole is sworn to secrecy and would be in some shit if anyone found out on top of that, which gives the widow Alicent some assurance in regards to discretion. Crazy attraction aside, which by the way was evident since the first time she saw him at the Heirs tourney when she was a teenager, and regardless of whether it's right or wrong, what I think about more as far as how this might compromise her position, Criston is a bit of a loose cannon and definitely didn't take being relegated to a side piece by Rhaenyra well. And what about old weird Larry and his feet stuff? He might not be a fan of this either, and he's a guy who can make stuff happen whenever he wants to. When Larys catches up with her later, the way he says indisposed when he says he tried to hook up with her before the small council meeting is enough to make her worry that he might be catching on. If nothing else, the show told us he's very competent at lurking around and finding stuff out in the first season, and he proves that again when he reports that he rooted out all the castle staff that betrayed their trust. It also showed us that he's a bit sadistic and not shy about murdering people, even his own family if he deems it necessary. So imagine being in bed at night trying to go to sleep if you thought you pissed him off. Most of what's going on at King's Landing is only mildly interesting because it all boils down to showing us that the transition from King Viserys to King Aegon II was bumbled. Otto wants to do what he's good at and keep writing letters to secure allegiances, and the new king is fairly unserious, as we see when he threatens to have his master of coin give his son a pony ride in the middle of the small council meeting. But also a loose cannon who just wants to use dragonfire to burn their way to victory at the same time. Also, because it was never the plan until a few minutes before Viserys died, he's completely unprepared to rule, which is illustrated when he meets the petitioners in the throne room and makes all sorts of promises that he immediately has to walk back when Otto reminds him that you just can't do that sort of thing. It all makes for the kind of temperament that needs to be reined in. And part of the conflict in the premiere is that Alicent and Otto have different ideas about how they should do that. On the other hand, Aegon has invited his brother Aemond in, who has proven himself to be a much better strategic mind, even if his Uncle Daemon cosplay went horribly wrong to become the spark that started the war in the first place. That last bit is unfortunate because everything else aside, Mr. Eyepatch is probably the guy you'd want on your team when things got hairy, especially since he rides Vhagar. And we've mostly moved on from the sex act, but one more point I want to bring up is that besides it just making sense for people in their situation to engage in such behaviors, it also does the thing I touched on before. I mentioned that if you dislike the Greens, you'd feel a certain way about it. But what about the flip side of that? If you felt it was necessary to point out all of the Blacks' moral failings as evidence for your team, what do you have to say about this? I brought that up because having only seen one episode, I got the sense that this is something they went into season 2 trying to do. Personally, I was a little deflated when the marketing campaign revolved around picking a side because in my interpretation of the story, that's kind of irrelevant. So the scene where Rhaenyra finds Luke and Arax's bodies on the beach gave me some hope. Even though we barely knew this kid, he was played by a couple of adorable actors and he had his little Jon Snow moment with Corlys. But because of the way the first season was structured to focus on efficiently hitting the major plot points to get us to the start of the conflict rather than character development, he barely even shared any scenes with his mother. The emotion here comes from us knowing how scared he was in his final moments. And because it sucks when kids die just at any time it happens anywhere. And because Emma Darcy is a very good actor and they kill the scene. And then also because her dragon feels her pain and adds a roar at the end for dramatic effect. But in a weird twist, because I was thinking about all of that stuff rather than being bowled over with emotion over the loss, it dawned on me that this is actually Rhaenyra's fault as far as it's the consequence of an objectively bad choice. Regardless if you're Team Black all the way and 100% behind her claim, you can't really put this all on Aemon and Vhagar, especially the way it played out in the show. She probably should have thought it through. Like, why wouldn't the Greens immediately try to send someone to Storm's End and lock down the Baratheons right away? The choice is something she has to live with alongside the grief of losing a son, just as Alicent has to live with her choices, which makes things more complicated and frankly more interesting than arguing who has the better claim. It's not to say this is evidence that Rhaenyra would be a bad queen either, because the premiere does a pretty good job of showing that this is a developing situation where choices have to be made and that consequences are unavoidable. And real quick, I half joked that the roar was for dramatic effect, but there's also quite a bit of lore there too. Arax was hatched the same year Luke was born, so they grew up together. And also, I remember people talking about Syrax being his mother after the finale, even though that feels like a lifetime ago. So they both lost a child here, and Arax is the first dragon to die in the dance. So I wasn't trying to diminish the weight of this scene. I was just trying to work in my primary complaint about the first season, in my hopes that they can course correct some now that the time skips are behind us. I brought up that the premiere made the promise of this scene being bigger by starting in Winterfell, and since basically no time has passed since the season 1 finale and the premiere, I'm also taking that as a promise that it'll achieve a much more reasonable pace. Given the nature of an opening episode, there are still a lot of loaded short interactions where everything seems intentional to provide details that will come back up later. Can't fault them for having to set the table, and some of those that stand out are Larys planning the idea of Otto being his father's hand in the back of Aegon's mind, doing a little bit of that magic that he used on Alicent whenever they first got together. Also, the way Aegon finally asserted himself in the throne room in regards to the smith named Hugh's request. Seems like that guy might turn out to be important later. Alicent telling her father that if he keeps undermining her voice, then her children will grow deaf to it, and her assertion that eventually the novelty of ruling will wear off for Aegon, and then they'll be able to run things as they wish. This is something that Otto agrees with, but he has to add that the path to victory now is one of violence. And the Dowager Queen knows that too, though she gets in the last word saying it doesn't have to be wanton. Before Rhaenyra returns to set things in motion for the ending, Daemon has a couple of charged interactions. First with the White Worm, whose improved accent makes her explanation for why she sold secrets to Otto sound completely reasonable. I particularly like the lines, "You speak of highborn games, and I have nothing of value for you," since you know she's telling the truth with the latter, since the conversation establishes that if she did, she'd be asking for gold in return. Then he berates Eric Cargill for letting Aegon usurp the throne, and his response about being sworn to protect the royal family kind of falling apart when they go after each other is also quite reasonable. And also, he left his post and his brother behind to be there for the queen. It's not a lot, but it's nice to get a reminder of how the conflict affects much more than the people with the magic blood and their mythical beasts, and that's where the real tragedy of the story lives. Rhaenyra's absence from Dragonstone comes to an end, and this is where I should mention how much the incredible costume and set design elevates everything that happens in the show. As far as it goes, I don't get super excited about the dragons on screen the way that some people do, but the shot of her approaching through the window, and then the entire sequence of her walking into the painted table room. There just aren't that many shows out there that could even look that good if they wanted to. And there's just so much attention to detail and everything that works together so that they can pull that off. Emma Darcy's command of the role is on full display as Daemon tells Rhaenyra he's ready to fly to Harrenhal, and Rhaenys gives her the update that the blockade is in place to cut all trade to King's Landing off. And then the delivery of, "I want Aemon Targaryen," with the period at the end, because that's it. That's the extent of her desires at that moment. It's just really good stuff. And while I'm talking about what works best, any of the lack of emotion I experienced during the beach scene, or I don't know, when Laena died in season 1, just for an example, the scene where Jace returned and tried and failed to fill his mother in on his work as her envoy kind of made up for it. It hits pretty hard. Daemon sets off to put Project Kill Aemon One-Eye in motion, and offers Mysaria her freedom if she can put him in touch with her spies in the Red Keep. Then we see a pyre scene where they say goodbye to Lucerys, which reminds you of how many of these Rhaenyra has attended already, and that she has another son when Jace picks up Joffrey so that he can throw his offering into the fire. And no, I didn't forget her other two, Aegon and Viserys, but they're both still pretty small. You might be able to strap Joffrey to a dragon if you needed to. And speaking of that, Alicent also mentions that she has 3 sons in one of her conversations with Otto, which might be a surprise for people who haven't read the book because Darren still hasn't appeared on screen. The funeral scene is cut with Alicent lighting candles at the Sept, which works as a callback to when they went there together as children and were being played by different actors. And when she lights a candle for Lucerys, it's a reminder that their friendship still matters to her. While we're on the subject, while it seems like Larys, Otto, and several other people close to the Queen have strong suspicions about Alicent and Kristen's relationship, Aemon apparently has no idea. It adds a fun dimension to the strategy meeting he has with Kristen, since he's trying to bitch about his mom and grandfather, and Cole keeps trying to defend her before eventually trying to shift the blame to Rhaenyra, which I guess he still hasn't let that one go. But bringing up their friendship backfires because Aemon points out that her love for the enemy makes her a fool, which is another way of acknowledging that it might be a problem going forward. Otto comes in and sends the Lord Commander out so he can have some alone time with Aemon, where he lets him know that he wouldn't be okay with them planning behind the backs of the king and his hand. Which, in case you forgot, he is talking about himself. He's still the hand. Aemon is quick to declare his loyalty, and then Otto puffs him up some by acknowledging that with Vhagar he's essentially the most powerful weapon in the Seven Kingdoms. But his point here is he's trying to maintain control. To that end, he does this really impressive thing. He says he understands that Aemon wants to act, but he needs to control his impulses. And he frames it by saying they both know that Aegon can't. It's such a smart move, and of course it works because that's how Aemon sees himself, as the one who actually has it together enough to be king, while his brother just wants to kick back with his boys and get drunk chilling on the Iron Throne. People dislike Otto, which okay, I can see where they're coming from, but this is a testament to why he's a great character to have around. If there was something I came out of my rewatch of season 1 wanting to see, it was how Aemon would be received by Alicent and Otto directly after he returned from feeding Luke to Vhagar. It just seemed like something that should happen on screen, since it was such an unfortunate event, and I honestly wasn't sure how it would go. More directly, would Aemon admit it was a mistake and that he couldn't control Vhagar at that moment, which would diminish his standing as a warrior, or would he lie to cover that up? There seemed like there was potential there for some depth in his choice and his mother's reaction based on the story he told her. As it stands now, we just have her being surprised that he walked into the small council meeting, and then later he said she was angry because she thinks he started the war. Does it mean they never had a conversation at all? Or was it just not important enough to include? With everything else out of the way, it's time to get to blood and cheese. Daemon sneaks ashore in King's Landing to meet up with one of the gold cloaks from the City Watch that he used to command who's still loyal. This is Blood, and Daemon uses the information he got from Mysaria to take him to find a royal rat catcher who has inside information about the secret tunnels in the Red Keep that we saw Rhaenyra sneak out of in season 1. The rat catcher is Cheese, and he's got gambling debts he can't pay, and he's a dog kicker just in case being a murderer for hire wasn't enough. Daemon explains that he wants them to kill Aemon, which is what Rhaenyra wants, a son for a son. But they also ask what they should do if they can't find him. The show decides to cut away before he answers to allow the audience to decide what it thinks he said. But given how things play out, it's not immediately important, which is not to say it won't be important at all. Cheese does get them inside, only they can't find Aemon. Setup is well done, it's dark, intense. Because Aegon's out in the throne room drinking, his Kingsguard are there with him. Blood and Cheese pass through the room where we last saw Aemon and Otto, so it feels like they might run into him around the next corner. But Cheese ends up in Helena's room instead. At first, Blood isn't interested. He wants to keep looking. Daemon had specifically asked for a son's head, but Cheese points out Jaehaerys and Jaehaera sleeping in their tiny little beds. I mentioned that they look so much alike earlier, and if you go back and watch the scene where she says she's afraid, she looks right at Jaehaerys' bed. The fact that they're children doesn't really slow Blood and Cheese down. They just want to know which one is the son so they can get their head and get out of there. She tries to bribe them with her necklace, which they take anyway, and then she points at her son. The show makes the choice to focus on the horrified look on her face, which is a smart one since, as I've already touched on, she is an interesting character that we care about, and it uses sound design to not cover up what's actually happening. What this mother is seeing before she grabs Jaehaera and runs out of the room. At first it was confusing because we've been watching them sneak around and there was no one there. We hadn't seen anyone beyond one of her ladies. And when she runs, there's just no one around to help her. Then it makes sense when she goes to her mother's room and we see that Kristen is in her bed where they're having sex again. Alicent composes herself enough to ask what happened, and she tells her they killed the boy as she holds Jaehaera's head and rocks her, and it lingers on Alicent for a long beat as she processes it before it cuts to black. I saw this early and haven't talked to anyone about it yet, so I've been going over it in my head for a few days, and I think it's pretty effective in the TV show as is. It's got the tension and delivers a gut punch, and the whole addition of Cole being away from his post while he's in bed with the Dowager Queen leaves you with a lot to think about, and I suppose it leaves him with a lot to think about too. That's all before you get to the bigger implication of how this will affect Rhaenyra personally, and the war more generally. What happened to Luke was tragic and a response was necessary, but now from the Greens' perspective, the Blacks have come into their home and killed an innocent child in front of his mother, which you could argue was par for the course in matters of succession. But the show would do better to concern itself with how choices are influenced by position and power, and how the consequences affect the people who make them. So on that level, I think it works. As a person who read the book, they changed this quite a lot. And while I think it's mostly fine, when I first watched it, I was disappointed in one change. I should say it's a lot scarier, and believe it or not, it's more brutal in the book. Alicent is actually there and they make her watch. And Cheese threatens Helaena, telling her blood might get bored and rape her daughter while the whole thing's going down. Most importantly, there's another kid there though. And because it's her 2-year-old son Maelor, the choice they force her to make is between which son she wants them to kill. She picks the 2-year-old, thinking he's too young to understand what's going on, and then they kill Jaehaerys anyway, telling Maelor, "Did you hear that, little boy? Your mama wants you dead." This always stuck with me because she has to be reminded of the incident every time she sees the son that is still there. But the more I thought about it, that also has a lot to do with Helaena not being fleshed out as a character in the book. It's the defining thing you remember about the book's version of her. But they're doing a lot of interesting things with the show version, so it might not be that big of a deal. At this point, it's not really a theory that she can see the future. It's just something that happens. So she knew this was going to happen, no one listened to her, and now she just experienced it for real. I imagine people might be disappointed though. This is a big event in the book, and people, myself included, had a lot of expectations going in. The other change is about Daemon and Rhaenyra's culpability. In the book, he's already at Harrenhal and just sort of sends word that Luke will be avenged, a son for his son. There's no comparable scene to Rhaenyra saying she wants Aemon Targaryen. When I read it the first time, I just assumed they were always trying to kill one of the little ones, and it made a different impression than what the show gave us. That said, it doesn't seem to be a departure from what they've already been doing as far as changes are concerned in the first season. The idea seems to be that these situations are more complicated than what you get from reading a maester's perspective on different accounts of the histories written years after the fact. And thinking about it like that, I'll be curious to see how it plays out and what people think about it. Overall, I really enjoyed this episode and thought it was a great way to start the second season. Everything that was good seems like it got a little better, and there were some improvements. Coming out of the rewatch, I didn't think it could look that much better overall. But there were several points in this episode where I was like, yeah, no, it actually does. We also got a new opening credit scene that is way more visually appealing. I thought the one they created for season 1 was interesting, and even though it wasn't as epic as the one for the original series, it was fine. It probably didn't have much appeal for casual viewers though, so I do think this is an improvement. I didn't have a lot of extra time to spend on it, but it looks great and appears to be a tapestry depicting Targaryen history. And the second time I watched it, the threads reminded me of Helena's prophecy from season 1 about dragons made of thread, which is the kind of bonus I can get behind. Oh boy, the sounds of the North, the Stark music, and the Northern accents, it all works so well that I just wish we could have spent more time there. When Cregan brought up the Greybeards and how they already saw too many winners, it reminded me of one of my favorite details that's mentioned in the main book series. Because winter is so harsh in the North, and there's only so much food to go around, a lot of times when it started to run out, old men would say they were going out hunting and never return. Some of their bodies would be found in the spring, but most were never seen again. To repeat myself, the promise of seeing more of Westeros and having more time to spend with the characters makes the start of this season feel different. The actors are all doing a terrific job too. I already pointed that out in several points, including Aegon the Magnanimous, which probably needs to be workshopped. They're doing some interesting things with the story as well. As the war is now inevitable, it's interesting to see how these cycles of power that Alicent and Rhaenyra seem to be victimized by as young girls repeat themselves as they gain power. Particularly the way that their kids are wrapped up in this. It makes for a promising start. I like that there was some effort to show how normal people get wrapped up in it too, and often pay the price while the powerful play their Game of Thrones. And that seems like a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.